Hello, everybody. In these strange times, a lot of us feel disempowered. It doesn't seem to matter what we do, we can't control the world. My guest today is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the author of a counterintuitive book in many ways for our times, Ordinary Magic: The Science of How We Can Achieve Big Change with Small Acts. The author is Gregory Walton, and Greg is joining us from Palo Alto. He teaches psychology at Stanford University. Greg, I don't want to make this just another conversation about Trump's America, but do you feel this sense broadly of sort of pessimistic disempowerment in America today, that people feel that it doesn't really matter what they do, they can't change anything, either in their own lives or more broadly?
Yeah, I think that everybody experiences that and has different relationships to that feeling, but I do think that there's a darkness in this time.
What do you mean by darkness? You mean in
Well, it
terms of our
feels, I think
agency?
people look at conflicts and the conflicts feel unresolvable. They look at major problems that society faces and they don't see progress on those problems. They don't even agree on what those problems are. They look at processes that we've developed to try to address problems like political processes, and they see those as broken. And I think that's kind of something that people agree on, but not much else.
It comes down to that A word, agency, which seems to be an American word. I mean, obviously it exists elsewhere. But do you think that Americans take agency more seriously than perhaps peoples from other countries, that America is founded on the ideal, the promise of agency? So when we can't act to change the world, either in the small scale of our own lives or more broadly, we get very dispirited and frustrated.
No, I don't think that. I do think that there's a distinctive ways to think about agency, and that differs across cultural contexts and other kinds of contexts. But I think that agency itself is something that's important for people around the world. Everybody is thinking about the circumstances that they face, thinking about the challenges that they face, that their communities face, and are thinking about what ways they can act that will be effective in advancing their goals and advancing their community's goals. How people define agency, how we talk about agency, how we think about our individual goals in relationship to the communities that we live in can differ quite widely. And approaches that try to support agency, which is a lot of ordinary magic, can differ in that way. But everybody is an agent within the worlds that they're operating.
So, would it be fair to call the book Ordinary Magic, the science of how we can achieve big change with small acts? Is it a book about agency?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. And it's also a book about what stops our agency. And that is articulated in the book in questions that come up in people's lives. Questions like, can I do it? Do I belong here? Does this matter if I work on this? And part of the idea in the book and the kind of world of research that this is coming from is that often we're walking into situations that implicitly or explicitly give us agency depriving questions. They seed in our minds questions like, maybe you're not good enough, maybe you're not adequate, maybe it doesn't matter, maybe you don't belong in this space. And that has the consequence often of becoming self-confirming.
What are the cultural elements of this issue of agency, Greg? It seems to me that you can't look at the internet these days, or certainly news sites like the New York Times, without coming across a piece about the anxiety of younger people, their sense of loss of agency. You teach young people at Stanford, maybe not typical young Americans, but nonetheless young Americans. Is there a generational crisis of agency in America today?
I don't know that I think there's a crisis of agency. I don't know that I would call it distinctively a crisis that's generational. I mean, I think, our politics has led, in the some on the right, on the Trump administration, to kind of want to break up the system, break up the institutions, to find a new path forward. And on the left, of course, there's a demoralization. And I think you had massive protests following the first Trump administration. You don't see that yet. I think there's a process of people trying to learn how they can act effectively. But I don't know that it's distinctly generational. I mean, I do think that young people look out at a world where, they're thinking about things like climate change. They're thinking about things like growing inequality. They're in, social media universes that ultimately don't robustly support the kinds of relationships and connections that people need to develop and grow. So they're feeling disconnected and disconnected from each other and from models for success. And I think these are all problems that schools and other kinds of institutions are contending with.
The title of the book, Ordinary Magic, of course, I'm guessing, Greg, is slightly ironic, because magic is something that just happens, and it's something that we may or may not believe in. It has a religious, non-scientific foundation. But you're a scientist, you're a psychologist at a leading university. What is, leaving aside the book, what does the term ordinary magic mean? I mean, all magic is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, ordinary magic refers to ordinary experiences that we can have for ourselves and for each other that help us set aside ordinary kinds of worries that would otherwise hold us back, and that can release us from those worries and unleash kind of extraordinary change. And it's ordinary, but it's also magical. It has this kind of dual quality. Sometimes we see this in like the simplest of ways, I think. So one of the experiences that I had as a young parent was we would take our kids to a campus daycare, and we would bike to the campus daycare. And when our kids were old enough to bike themselves, they would bike home on these tiny little, 12-inch wheel bikes. And sometimes we'd be a block or two from home and 15 minutes past dinner time, and they would wail, they're 3-4 years old. They'd wail, "I'm tired, I can't go any further." And I had this realization, in part inspired by research by my collaborator, Veronica Yaab, who's a scholar at the University of Vienna now, that they were taking a momentary feeling of tiredness as a cue that they had to stop. And so then I took to saying to them, it's when you're tired and you keep going that your muscles get stronger. And a couple of weeks later, we were coming home, and our path home involved this steep, winding curve going up a hill. And our daughter, who was about 4, was trying to beat her record each time to get up as far as she could on this hill. We brought chalk to mark along the path how far she'd gotten. And one time, she not only beat her previous record, she crushed it. Like, she got all the way to the top. And our son, Oliver, and I were standing there cheering. And she said, "You know how I did it?" And we said, "No." And she said, "When I wanted to stop, I just kept going." And so, I think often in life, we have these little psychological questions in our heads that pop up that say things like, maybe I need a break now. Maybe I can't do it. Maybe I'm not a math person. Maybe I don't belong in this space. And when we heed those questions, we sell ourselves short. And ordinary magic are these kind of ordinary gestures that we can do for ourselves and for others that set those questions aside and then let people climb the hill, as it were.
So that's a model for parenting. Did you stumble on that, or did that come from your own
as I said,
academic insights?
It came from Veronica's research. So Veronica was interested in the idea that people can have different kind of lay beliefs about the nature of willpower, that you might think that willpower is very, very highly limited, that it runs out quickly, it's easily depleted. That's an idea that's been sold literally, but both by psychologists and also by the advertising industry. So for example, the notion of a coffee break itself was developed by coffee sellers in the mid-20th century. Or you can think about Snickers ads that say, "You're not you when you're hungry." they're selling us the idea that we have a limited amount of willpower and it runs out in a rapidly, and when it's run out, you're unable to regulate yourself to achieve your goals. And Veronica's research shows that that belief system, if you believe that, you give up on goal pursuits more quickly. You treat little feelings of tiredness as a reason to stop. But you don't have to believe that. You can also believe what she calls a non-limited theory of willpower, and that it is not believing that willpower is unlimited. It just means that you don't think it's so sensitive to a momentary depletion. Like a few minutes of concentration isn't going to stop you, especially when you're working on something you care about, especially on something that matters to you. So I was thinking about her research when I was saying that statement to the kids.
So I know in the book, Ordinary Magic, you're not selling chocolate bars or hamburgers or gasoline. But are you selling something? Is this a self-help book? Long-term listeners of this show, viewers, know that I'm not always a great fan of self-help books. I have a number of problems with them. How would you define this book? And what exactly, are you selling something? I mean, obviously people need to buy the book.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of self-help books are like not actually grounded in science, right? And they're not actually, they're advocating for ideas that have, maybe multiple degrees of the game of operator away from some origin of knowledge. And then they come off as kind of, vague or unhelpful potentially, or just like not credible, I think. I'm a scientist, as you said, and I've done a lot of the work that underlies the research, and I'm part of the community of people in social psychology and in related fields that's done this work. And so what my hope is that through sharing the science more broadly, we can all understand more clearly the questions that we face and the questions that other people face in common situations, and that can help us act more effectively, both for ourselves and for each other, to address these kinds of questions and let them go. Sometimes you see this beautifully depicted even in children's picture books. So a classic picture book that's a favorite of mine is the Robert McCloskey book, One Morning in Maine. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
No.
So One Morning in Maine begins with a 4-year-old girl. She looks to be about 4. Maybe she's slightly older, named Saul. And Saul is looking forward to a fun day with her father where they're going to go to Bucks Harbor and get ice cream. But she wakes up and she finds that she's lost a tooth. And she treats this as a calamity. So she says, Mama, I lost my tooth. I'm not going to be able to go to Bucks Harbor and have ice cream with Daddy. And her mother then says to her, Saul, when you lose a tooth, that's when you become a big girl. And then the rest of the book is about Saul kind of trying out that idea for herself. So she asks her mother, did you lose your teeth when you were little? Was that how you became a big girl? She interacts with various animals like seals and asks if they lost teeth. She goes to meet her father, and her father reinforces that idea. And that in that moment with Saul's mother is kind of executing ordinary magic with Saul. She's telling Saul what it means to lose a tooth, and that it doesn't have to mean something that would be a calamity for Saul. If Saul's mother had responded instead with something like, "Oh, just eat your breakfast," that would be what I call kind of psychologically unwise or apsychological. It would be insensitive to the reasonable concerns that a 4 or 5-year-old kid might have when they lose a tooth. They haven't been down that road before. And similarly, just as an example, like a first-generation student comes to college, right? They're coming into a space where their community, or at least their parents, have not belonged before. So they might reasonably wonder, is this an environment in which I'll belong, in which people will respond to me, in which I'll be able to grow and contribute? And then if something bad happens, it can feel to them like, maybe this is a place where I don't belong. That can set off what I call a downward spiral. But if you can share with people the basic truth that everybody at some level wonders at first about whether they belong in college, that can get better with time, that an early setback or an early exclusion doesn't have to mean you don't belong in general in college, that can set off what I call an upward spiral. And that's both ordinary and it's kind of magical. So in the data, for example, we see that exercises like that can improve students' lives even as far out as a decade later. And it happens because in the college context, it embeds students in that college world more. They develop more close friends. They join more student groups. They find a mentor. They get more academic direction. They know where they're going. They're able to direct their efforts and grow and learn. And then they're able to work towards the goals that they have that college can support. So that, again, is ordinary and it is magic. It feels magical.
It's interesting, Greg, that the two examples you've offered for ordinary magic. One is around a 4-year-old girl, the other about one of your younger children. Are we all essentially kids? It is the job of a psychologist either to treat us all as 4-year-olds or 10-year-olds, or to just watch kids so carefully that you can understand the human condition that way?
Well, I do love kids, and I have a silly little joke theory, which is that we all have an essential age, and it's who we really are deep down in the inside, and it's stable and fixed. And when your essential age and your chronological age match, then life is good, and you match well with other people, and you interact well with people who have your essential age. And my essential age is undisputably about 4 years old. So there's truth, I think, in what you're saying. But I also, one of the reasons why I value books like the McCloskey book and other of the best picture books is I do think that they're like kind of perfect poems, and they capture something that's essential in the human condition. So you can think about the McCloskey book from a parenting perspective, but you could also think about it in a work context, like a manager who's, bringing on a new employee on a team, and that new employee loses a tooth, so to speak, on an early assignment. And that person is probably trying to figure out, how do I fit in this place? Is that screw up a reason why I'm not going to be able to fit or succeed in this environment? And a wise manager, like one who can understand the question that new employee might be facing, is able to see it and anticipate it, and with grace and deftness, help that person to work through that circumstance so that they can be a valued member of the team. So I do think that there is that sense in which children's literature, the best children's literature, can kind of show us very clearly something that we can all relate to and experience. And then we can ask ourselves, how would that look like in a work context? How would that look like in a relationship context? How would that look like in a post-secondary school context, or whatever it might be?
What's the goal, the end goal of ordinary magic, Greg, in terms of achieving big change with small acts? Is it to become happier, to become more productive, to conform more with people around us? Because some people might argue, well, unhappiness is a healthy thing, or insecurity is a healthy thing. It creates great art. It creates great literature.
I think the goal is to help people flourish and achieve their goals, whatever those goals might be. So as we're working towards goals, often it is because we value those goals that we can ask questions that can get in the way. It's because you value a goal that a question like, can I really do this? Or will people really value this thing that I'm doing? Will they respond well to it? Icky, kind of pejorative questions pop up, and our habitual response to that is to suppress them, to push them away because they're threatening, literally because they're threatening. We don't want to contend with them. And in ordinary magic, the change begins by surfacing those questions, by seeing that they're normal, that they're reasonable, that they come out of the conditions that we're in. It's not a first-generation student's fault that she worries about whether she might belong in college. Like, literally, her family hasn't before. It's a normal question. And then once it's normal and there's nothing threatening about it, then you can say individually and collectively, well, how do we want to think about this? How do we contend with that and go forward?
Greg, you talk about goals. I mean, historically, and you don't need me to tell you this, some psychologists, Freudians, would argue that what we think are our goals are actually quite different, sometimes the reverse. How do you, as a psychologist, and we as the subjects here, how do we know our goals?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that develops over time. And in part, that develops by interacting with the world and trying things out. And in part, that's the role of educators and just others in general who are older than us and know more. So in some ways, I think maybe the very most important thing that a teacher can do for a student, especially a student who is struggling in school, maybe they're getting into conflicts, is to cast an image of the good and competent person that that young person can become, an image that is both positive and fitting, and that allows that young person to ask the question, like, is that a kind of person that I want to be, that I could work towards? And then to regulate their behavior to achieve that, if in fact it is fitting. So I think it's a dynamic process, a process of kind of co-construction with yourself and with the others around you.
What about the role of behavioral economics in all this? We've done lots of shows on that, the notion of nudge here. Are you nudging? Is there a
No,
carrot and
I'm
stick
not. And
here?
let me say about that. So I can take an object like this mug and I can nudge it. And there's a sense in which nudges treat people like objects like that. That is, they can have a kind of paper thin representation of the object that they're contending with. And in ordinary magic, in a social psychological approach, we're really deeply trying to understand how people are making sense of themselves, other people, or social situations. Now, don't get me wrong. So in a nudge world, you might do something like say, we'd like people to eat healthier. So let's rearrange the cafeteria so it's easier to get healthy options and harder to get the candy bars. And I might, as a user of that cafeteria, I might appreciate that. Like I might appreciate that support in being able to have a healthier lunch, for example. But you're not doing anything that's contending with how I'm actually making sense of myself or how I think about healthy eating. You're not giving me anything that I would take away from that cafeteria into a different eating environment. And there's then there can be an absurdity to a kind of nudge approach. So, for example, you wouldn't nudge somebody else's marriage. Like if a friend came to you to talk about a difficulty they had in their marriage, you wouldn't nudge them. Like that would be disrespectful. With wise interventions, that's the scientific term for the area of research behind ordinary magic, we're really trying to think deeply about the questions that get posed to people. So, for example, in a marital conflict situation, you might be asking a question implicitly or explicitly. Is my marriage in trouble? Is my partner disrespecting me? And the interventions that develop from this approach are essentially structured ways to create space for people to see those questions and think through those questions so that they can work towards answers that will be helpful to them.
So there's no role in ordinary magic, Greg, for government departments. This is a book designed for humans to read, to use what you call small acts to achieve big changes in their life. If you
No,
talked
no,
about food, for example, if someone from a government department who was concerned about obesity in the United States or in California and wanted to challenge that, your book wouldn't be helpful.
no, I would disagree with that. So in some ways, like the kind of jokey distinction between social psychology and clinical psychology is that social psychology is psychology of normal people in normal situations, and clinical psychology is abnormal. So from a social psychological approach, we're trying to understand the questions that come to mind that are reasonable to a person, maybe to any person in a situation. And when we think about it at that level, we're doing a couple things. The first thing is that when you have that question in your mind, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just a normal person in the situation. And the second thing is that institutions can get wiser about the kinds of questions that come up for a person within their environment. So the college or university knows that it's pretty common for people to worry about whether they belong at first in college. And that can be particularly the case, for example, for first generation students. That can lead to very specific programmatic responses, including in how the university talks about the transition to college, the kinds of experiences that they set up early on in college that can make those concerns visible and make it okay to have them and kind of develop a process way to think about them. Or, for example, research by my colleague Ali Crum and some of her colleagues has looked at kids who are undergoing oral immunotherapy. This is kids who have peanut allergies. And it's a kind of exposure therapy where kids are exposed step by step to beginning with very minute amounts of peanuts and that grow over time. And what Ali does in this work is she works with the care team to message to kids and their families about how to understand non-life-threatening side effects that can come up with this kind of treatment. So usually what people are told is just something like, you might experience some nausea, you might experience some rashes, you might experience some discomfort, some stomach pain. Those are normal, just suffer through it. But people who've been told their whole life that a tiny amount of peanut could kill them can think things like, this might be a sign that my allergy is really significant. This might be a sign that my body is resisting treatment. This might be a sign I'm about to die, right? People can have these kind of catastrophic interpretations. And those are reasonable, right? They come from the situation that the person is in and the kinds of things they've been taught and have learned. And so what Ali shows is that if you instead message to people that sometimes those side effects can be your body responding well to treatment, as some evidence suggests, that actually makes treatment go better, helps people stay on course better. So that in a health context is an organization, in that case, getting wise. Like they're starting to understand the kinds of predictable, reasonable questions that come up for a person in their situation, and then they're being responsive to that to make their work improve. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're the co-director of the Dweck Walton lab at Stanford University. What do you do there? What kind of people come into your lab?
Yeah, we have researchers, grad students, postdocs, visiting scholars from around the world, often people who are interested in particular problem spaces and how we can understand those problem spaces psychologically and then help create what we call wise interventions to help those go better. Sometimes that's very small scale work, sometimes it's very theoretical, and sometimes it's much larger scale and broader.
Is everything, Greg, psychological? I mean, are there some?
Yeah, I mean, every problem that we
every
have.
problem you could say, well, that's just not a psychological issue.
Now, every problem is psychological. No problem is all psychological. Every problem is partly psychological. So, every time we behave, every time we adopt an attitude, every time we have a feeling, there's a psychological process behind that that's producing that. And that is part of the dynamic that is when we face problems that is contributing to problems. Of course, that psychology is also sitting within a lot of other forces that are also part of problems that we see.
It seems, Greg, the big psychological of our age that disturbs any of us that we want to escape from is one kind of addiction or another. Obviously, hard drugs, alcohol, smoking, technology now. How does your book, Ordinary Magic, address this issue of kicking addiction?
Yeah, let me describe to you a new study that's not yet even written up yet, that my current doctoral student, Rana Hashemi, has done. So Rana comes, she's has a background in substance use education for teenagers, and she came to this problem space from her own background and experience with drugs in high school. And in her own experience, she tells this story, so I can tell you the story that she one time came to class, the one class in high school that she had where she felt like her teacher respected her and saw in her something good. There was no other teacher. There was one teacher, but she came to this teacher's class high, and he looked at her, and she could tell in that look that he knew and that he was disappointed in her. And she tells this story to convey then that she never did that again. She never came back to his class high. And so as a graduate student now, she has run a study in which she is asking young adults to think about their experiences in high school And these are all young adults who used drugs as an adolescent, often marijuana or other drugs. And she gives them a situation, and the situation is, your friends are going to go get high at lunch. Do you join them or not? And that's the question. But what she does before that is she manipulates whether or not they think they have a single relationship in school with a teacher who sees in them a good and skilled kind of person that they could become. And what she finds is that when kids when people are imagining this circumstance, it's just an imagined study. When people are imagining this circumstance, if they have that one adult in school who sees in them a good and skilled person that they can become, they're more likely to decline that opportunity to go get high at school. So I think that one of the kinds of ordinary magic, this is part of why I emphasize that one of the most important things I think that educators can do is give a younger person a good image, a positive image and a fitting image of who they can become, because then it recruits that person's agency to realize that ambition. And if you don't have that, if there's nobody in school, if school is a lonely and judgy and like, I don't know if I can say this word, but shitty place, right? Then like, screw it. Like,
you're allowed to say that on my show, Greg. You can say.
What's that?
You're allowed to say that on my show.
Okay, so if school's a shitty place, then like, what the hell, like, go get high. It doesn't matter. But if there's a teacher, for example, who's showing you how you could become something that is right and fitting for you, then you don't want to do that anymore.
But does that introduce the element of guilt here, self-control, make you feel bad by doing things?
I don't think that there's, I think that, I don't think that guilt is on the table here, but let me describe another situation where it is in an interesting way. This is another project by a current graduate student who is interested in this pandemic of cheating on college campuses. But she was interested in how universities communicate to students when they're being informed that there's an honor code investigation on them. So you might have taken a class, now you get this letter. The letter tells you you're being accused of cheating in the class. There's going to be an investigation process. And the student, whose name is Kimia Sadatian, finds that the standard communications are very legalistic, and they're cold and harsh, and people feel very, very judged in response. She does a lot of work interviewing students about these experiences. And through that process, she rewrites a letter that it maintains the same policies around cheating, but also is what she calls belonging and growth secure. So for example, it says things like, our goal in every case is for this process to be one of growth. We recognize that there are reasons why these things happen. In each case, we want to understand why that happens so we can support people's growth. And she finds that when she revises the letter like that, people feel less shamed, but in some cases, they actually feel more shame. Okay? So it's like if you've done something potentially wrong, and now somebody is coming down hard on you and they're defining you by that act, you have to defend yourself. It's like you can't admit anything. Like, you have to defend your image because it is under attack. You can't experience shame. But if somebody treats you with grace and they affirm that belonging and growth, then no longer do you feel like they are trying to shame you. And it allows you, ironically, to experience some shame. And shame, of course, is the emotion that we need when we're trying to repair our bonds with the community.
Very interesting. You use the J word, Greg. My daughter, who's not 4 years old, although sometimes perhaps behaves like a 4-year-old, doesn't like that word. Her generation uses the word judgy in a pejorative sense. Is that cultural? Why don't we like to be judged? Or certainly, why don't the 20-somethings in our world like to be judged? Why have they developed this word judgy as a dark pejorative, particularly a critique of their parents?
Well, I don't think it's new. I mean, it was the sociologist Charles Cooley, who was at the University of Michigan more than 100 years ago, who wrote about what we sometimes call the cocktail party effect. Now you're in a crowded room and you hear somebody across the room say your name, and you have no idea what they're talking about, how they're just talking about you, but you heard your name and you caught your attention and you want to know what it is that they're saying. I think sometimes we have this sense, this desire to believe, this desire to be able to control our identity, like to be able to control how other people see us. And that, of course, is really important for the opportunities you have. But in reality, your identity is getting constructed all the time, both by you and by people all around you. Some people who might look favorably upon you, some people who might look disfavorably upon you, some people who might be kind but careless or not right for you. And that image that exists of you, and that kind of, I think of it sometimes as like yourself in a bathroom with mirrors all around you, and there's this complexity of images surrounding you. And you can think about that like in a social media universe, and these images all around of a person. I don't know if you ever saw the musical Dear Evan Hansen, but it depicts that on the stage. It like depicts these images in a social media world of a person represented in 1,000 ways. And that's disorienting, and it might not be right for you. It might not be true for who you are or who you want to be. And it might hurt you and constrain you. And so,
but aren't we all, Greg, naturally, to borrow this word again, judgy? We all make moral judgments. When we meet someone, we think, well, this is a good person, this is a bad person, this is a boring person, this is a person who I don't want to talk to anymore.
That, of course we do. Yeah.
So in a sense, we have to accept, for better or worse, the judgy nature of the world.
Well, no, I think that there's times where that really hurts us, and it makes it worse for everybody. So one of the interventions that I think is most powerful that's talked about in the book is this one called Lifting the Bar, which was one we developed right across the bay over in Oakland. And this is an exercise for young people transitioning back to school from juvenile detention. So these are kids who are almost all students of color. They're almost all boys. They have all been convicted of a crime, right? So in American society, and in many other societies, there's a very strong stereotype about this group of young people. And they come back into a classroom, like in an Oakland school, and they are essentially predefined by that stereotype. And they're aware of that, and the teacher's aware of that, and everybody's aware of that. And so what Lifting the Bar is essentially a platform for these young people to say who they really are, what their values really are, what their goals are in school that they would like help with, and what challenges they have in working towards their goals, to a teacher that they specifically have nominated as someone who could help them in that process. So imagine you're teaching, 10th grade English or something at Castlemont High School in Oakland. In our study, you would receive a letter from our team, and that letter would say, all kids need strong relationships with adults to succeed in school, especially in difficult circumstances. This child is coming back to school from juvenile detention, and this child has chosen you, Andrew, as the person that he would like support from in this time and in this process. Here's what this child would like you to know about him. And then we pipe in some of the content that the child had provided to us. We delivered this on a randomized basis in Oakland a number of years ago, and in an early evaluation. We found that this actually reduced the rate at which students recidivated back to juvenile detention from 69% to 29%. And it was because what we had done was give young people a platform to say who they really are and who they want to be, in a way that an adult, a person in a position of power, and a person in a relevant role to them could hear and then respond to appropriately. So I don't think we want to just like allow situations to proceed as they are that define us or other people in ways that become toxic for everybody involved. I mean, this is a dynamic that's obviously toxic for the young people. It's also toxic for the adults. I mean, imagine you're teaching this class and you've got this kid coming back and you're like, oh my God, what kind of problems is he going to cause me? I don't want to deal with him, right? And that cycle of mistrust and conflict is like why people leave teaching.
Finally, Greg, the book is called Ordinary Magic: The Science of How We Can Achieve Big Change with Small Acts. It's an important book, certainly an important subject. The more you talk, though, it doesn't seem to me as if small acts are easy acts.
Yeah.
Is that fair? That you're not
Yeah.
talking, and that's what I'm always somewhat skeptical and wary of self-help books, because they always promise the earth without you actually having to do anything. And
Yeah. So
what I like about what you seem to be saying is that, okay, maybe some of these acts are small, but they're not necessarily easy.
Completely. I completely agree with that. So that lifting the bar intervention, it was 15 months of hard, formative work before we designed that, of listening to kids, of focus groups, of one-on-one conversations, of design processes. But the thing is that if we can identify these, for example, turning points in a student's life, in a teacher's experience, in institutional processes, if we can identify those turning points that matter, we can invest in that kind of process to learn to get that right. And then that can be transformative for people's experiences. So I always think of the word simple in quotes. They look simple. Sometimes they're cheap to implement, but they are, there's a lot of complexity under the hood, and it's getting that right that's important.
Well, Greg Walton may look simple, but he's actually complicated. The book is interesting, a book about most important subject, about, if not how to make ourselves happier, certainly allowing us to achieve what we want, which most of us don't seem to be able to do. So congratulations, Greg, on the book. Keep doing the good work. Keep sweating. I think we need you to sweat to get to our small changes. Thank you so much.